All right, we're going to factor polynomials by grouping. We're going to factor these completely. Zoom in just a little bit. And on these, we can group them in order to factor out the greatest common factor. So if we look at these first two terms and we group them together, and then the last two terms and group them together, I can see right away that there's things that I can factor out. In this first group, we can divide both 3 and 15 by 3, so I can factor that out. And we also have an x cubed and an x squared. So I can factor out x squared because that's the largest value that they have in common with each other. So I have 3x squared, and I'm going to see what I have left over. All right, so I factored out 3x squared from 3x cubed, meaning I'm just left with x. Because 3 divided by 3 is 1. I could put a 1 there, but I don't have to. And x cubed divided by x squared is just x. Bring down the minus. And now looking at the second term. 15 divided by 3 is 5. And x squared divided by x squared is 1. So I'm just left with 5. Plus, and when you're factoring by grouping, you always want it to be addition between your two sets that you've grouped. So if there's subtraction, you want to change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next integer to negative, or next term to negative. All right, so in this next group, the only thing I can factor out or that I can divide both terms by is 2 times, well, 2 divided by 2 is 1, so I'm left with just x, minus 10 divided by 2 is 5. All right, so now we should have a greatest common factor. What's left in parentheses should be the same, x minus 5 for both of them. So I can factor out that greatest common factor of x minus 5 and multiply it by what's left over. Well, here we just have the 3x squared, and over here, plus 2. And this is our polynomial factored, which we created by grouping together terms where we could factor something out as a greatest common factor. All right, so let's try another one that's similar to that, and then we'll get a little more complicated. All right, so in this one, I do see that the first and second terms, I do have some things in common that I can factor out. Okay, but remember I said you always want plus in the middle? This is subtraction. So I'm going to change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next. And then I can group those second two terms. So you always want it to be plus in between your two parentheses. All right, so I'm going to start with what can I divide the numbers by? So we have 20 and 8. I know I can divide both of those by 4. So that's what I'm going to factor out. We have y cubed and y squared. The largest value for y that I can factor out is y squared. So to see what I have left over, I'm just going to divide everything by 4y squared. 20 divided by 4 is 5, and y cubed divided by y squared is just y. Plus, 8 divided by 4 is 2, and y squared divided by y squared is 1, so I just have 2 because 2 times 1 is still 2. All right, I have plus in between, so I'm going to bring that down. All right, remember over here on this first one, I wanted what was in the parentheses to be the same. Okay, they're both positive. I have a 5y plus 2, and I want what's left over to be positive 5y plus 2. But I see that I have two negatives, or a negative and a minus. So I know I want to factor out something negative. So I'm going to factor that negative out so I can have both values positive inside this parenthesis. Right? So we have 15 and 6. I know the only thing I can factor out is 3. And again, there's a y here, but there's not a y, so I can't factor out the y. All right, so negative 15 divided by negative 3 is positive 5, and I still have the y. That minus can be treated as a negative. So negative 6 divided by negative 3 is positive 2. So I do have the same thing in the parentheses. If I had left that negative inside, negative 5y minus 2, we wouldn't have the same thing. So make sure you're paying attention to that. All right, greatest common factor in both of these is 5y plus 2, so factor that out. Multiply it by what's left over, 4y squared plus negative 3 or minus 3. That's our answer. All right, so in both of these, we just had one variable. Here we were working with x, even though we had cube and square terms, and here we were working with y. So now we're going to evolve a few more variables. So on this one, we have 35xy, or xw plus 21xu minus 10 yw minus 6yu. So there are a whole bunch of different variables. I'm going to zoom in on this just to make sure that you understand this one. So if I look at these first two terms, okay, well, they have things in common where I could factor out a 7 because 35 and 21 are both divisible by 7, and they both have an x. So they do have things in common that I could factor out. So I'm going to group them together. Again, I want addition in between, so I'm going to change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next. And I'm going to group the next two terms because we do have a 10 and a 6, so I know I can factor out 2, and they both have a y. Okay, so if there weren't things in common, I could rearrange the terms if I needed to, but it works out. So I know 35 and 21 are both divisible by 7, and they both have an x. So that's what I factored out of that first parenthesis. 35 divided by 7 is 5, and well, x divided by x is 1, but I'm left with a w. Plus 21 divided by 7 is 3. I factored out that x, so I'm just left with a u. There's plus in between. All right, remember you want what's in the parentheses to be the same on this one. So I want it to be positive 5w plus 3u. Well, again, we have two negative values, a negative and a minus. So I know I have to factor out a negative. Well, 10 and 6 are both divisible by 2. And both of these terms have a y. So I'm going to factor out y. Times negative 10 divided by negative 2 is positive 5. When I factor out the y, I'm left with w. Negative 6 divided by negative 2 is positive 3. And I'm left with u when I factor out the y. And so they are the same, 5w plus 3u. So I'm going to factor out that greatest common factor of 5w plus 3u, and I'm going to multiply it by what's left over. When we factor out this 5w plus 3u, we have a 7x plus negative 2y. Or instead of putting plus a negative, I can just put minus 2y. And you might be wondering, even though we have a negative out here, and I changed my subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next, you do need to have it plus inside, because if I had left that as minus and I had said, oh, 10's positive, I would have had a positive value and a negative value, and I could never get the two positives. So you always have to make it addition in between. All right, let's try one more like that. I'm going to group these first two terms, group the second two terms. This one has addition in between, so we're set. We don't have to change anything there. All right, 6 and 15. I can factor out 3. They both have a q. Multiply it by what's left over. 6 divided by 3 is 2. I factor the q out, so I'm left with 2p. Bring down the minus. 15 divided by 3 is 5. Because we factored out the q, we're left with the s. Bring down that plus. All right, we can't factor anything for the 2 or the 5, but they both have an r. So I'm just going to factor that r out. let's see, when we factor out r, we're left with 2p minus 5s when we factor that r out. And that is exactly what I wanted to be left with, so that they're the same. So factor out your greatest common factor, 2p minus 5s. And make sure you don't confuse that s with a 5. It's very easy to get your s's and 5's mixed up. Multiply it by what's left over. All right, we have a 3q plus r. That is our answer. All right, I am going to have you go ahead and try 4 problems. They're very similar to the ones that I just did. Go through the answers, or go through the problems. When you're ready for the answers, go ahead and come back and I'll go through them with you. All right, zoom in just so you can see my work a little better. So on the first one, I'm going to group the first 2 terms, change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next. So here I can factor out 2x squared. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and we're left with x plus 2 divided by 2 is 1. X squared divided by x squared is 1, so we're left with just 1. You have to put that 1 there. You can't, it's not 0. Because 2x squared divided by 2x squared is 1, not 0. Bring down that plus. I need everything inside my parenthesis over here to be positive because we have a minus and a negative. We're factoring out that negative. And it's negative 5. They can be factored out. Negative 15 divided by negative 5 is 3. We're left with the x. Negative 5 divided by negative 5 is positive 1. Okay, greatest common factor, 3x plus 1. Factor it out and multiply by what is left over, 2x squared minus 5 or plus negative 5. All right. Number 2. Group the first 2 and last 2. We already have addition in between. We cannot factor out a number, but we can factor out y squared. So we have 2y minus 7 in parentheses, plus, here we can factor out a 2, and 4 divided by 2 is 2y, minus 14 divided by 2 is 7. So, greatest common factor, factor out 2y minus 7, and multiply that entire thing by what's left over. Y squared plus 2. All right, now to the ones with multiple variables. All right, so group the first 2 terms, change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next, group the last 2 terms. Here we can divide both 8 and 4 by 4. And we have an x that we can factor out in each. So 8 divided by 4 is 2. We factored out the x, but we still have a w. Plus 4 divided by 4 is 1. X divided by x is 1, so we're left with just a u. Plus, right here, we want everything in parentheses to be positive, so we have to factor out that negative for the second parenthesis. Negative 3 is factored out because 6 and 3 are both divisible by 3, and they both have a y. So negative 6 divided by negative 3 is positive 2. We factored out the y, so we're left with w. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 is positive 1. Y divided by y is 1. So we're left with just a positive u, or plus u. So greatest common factor, 2w plus u. And multiply it by what's left over, 4x, either plus a negative or minus 3y. And the last one, group those first 2 terms, change subtraction to addition, change the sign of the next. Group the last 2, and all right, we have 20 and we have 8. We're going to factor out 4. They both have a q. 20 divided by 4 is 5. Factored out the q, so it's 5p. minus 8 divided by 4 is 2. Factored out the q, so it's 2s plus. All right, in the parentheses, we have our first term's positive, second term's negative. Here, the first term is negative, second term's positive. So, in order to switch that, you factor out the negative. And let's see, we have a 30 and we have a 12. Well, we can divide them both by 6, and they both have an r. All right, negative 30 divided by negative 6 is positive 5. And we factored out that r, so it's it's positive 5p. Positive 12 divided by negative 6 is negative 2. That's how we got the minus 2. Positive divided by negative is a negative. Factored out the r, so we're left with negative 2s, or minus 2s. Okay, greatest common factor, 5p minus 2s. This one's a little more tricky. Multiply it by what's left over. 4q plus a negative or minus 6r. But there's a problem here. We still have a greatest common factor that we can factor out. Okay, we can divide both 4 and 6 by 2. And it's not simplified till everything's factored out, until every greatest common factor is factored out. So I have to factor a 2 out of this one. I'm going to put it in front because everything's multiplied together, order doesn't matter. So this 5p minus 2s stays the same, but 4q divided by 2 is 2q, minus 6r divided by 2 is 3r. So if you didn't do that step, please do it now, because you have to have everything inside the parentheses as simplified as possible. If there's a greatest common factor, in this case 2, that you can divide them both by, you have to get rid of it.